very happy to welcome you to this Masterclass on Performative Practices for Diverse Economies. It's with great honor and pleasure that I welcome Professor Katherine Gibson here on behalf of the Rural Sociology Group and the Center of Space, Place and Society. As you all know, Professor Gibson is Professor in Economic Geography at the Western Sydney University, and worldwide known for her influential work on rethinking economies. And not only has she written many inspiring books, many of them together with the late Julie Graham, Gibson-Graham also started a vibrant community of academic and community researchers and activists working on all kinds of issues. And as I learned yesterday, she also just returned from her biking holiday in France, and of course, as a Dutch person, that makes me appreciate her.
Not on a Dutch bicycle.
So I'm very pleased to see you all here today as well. We have a very diverse group of master students, PhDs, researchers, professors, guests from Kyoto University. And I know you've all been inspired by the work of Katherine Gibson and Gibson-Graham. So I'm looking forward to hosting an inspiring conversation with all of you.
I think there was some idea that I might just lay out a few of the kind of background ideas that have informed the research that I've been doing with Julie and then with the Community Economies Collective. And some of it is kind of encapsulated in this more popular book, Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities. But this is a kind of more easy to read book that is based on more, I guess, more theoretically or academically engaged research that's been published in articles and books as well. So I'll talk a bit about some of those background ideas. And to do that, I probably need to show a few PowerPoints then. Not that exciting ones, but together this morning. Yeah. All right. Well, so this idea of capitalocentrism is a kind of guiding thinking or guiding theory, or something against which the work I've been doing is arrayed against this idea of capitalocentrism. And what is capitalocentrism? How did we come up with the idea of capitalocentrism? Well, it is a discourse, a system of knowledge that enrolls all economic identity into capitalism, positioning a wide range of practices in relation to this central kind of figure of capitalism. So any other kind of economic practice is either seen as the opposite of, a subordinate to, a complement of, or existing within the orbit of something called capitalism. Now, any of you that might have come through feminist training or post-structuralist training would recognize that this formulation is coming out of a post-structuralist feminist perspective, where instead of capitalocentrism, the term that was coined was phallogocentrism. So many people who critiqued Enlightenment thinking critiqued the logos, the way knowledge was centered on a particular kind of Western Enlightenment knowledge, and then feminists took that to say, well, it's actually, there's a kind of a masculinism to Western knowledge, a phallogocentrism, a kind of a relationship of knowledge to the phallus in the symbolic sense, which sets up a certain kind of thinking as dominant. So, for instance, if we think about the way that woman as a figure is positioned, the meaning of woman is often given in relation to the meaning of man. So woman is the opposite of, the subordinate to, a complement to, sort of existing within men's world, at a very simple sense. But if we go to a more symbolic sense, we can see that that kind of domination of ideas by a dominant figure against which an other is posed structures so much of Western Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment thinking. So we have, you know, a conception of the economy that runs the world, and society and culture and environment kind of are subordinate to the demands of the economy or have to fit in with. Or we have, you know, so these binarisms that by which most thinking is structured in this tradition. This binarism is always kind of falls into a positionality of one dominant term and the other subordinate. So that's a kind of an epistemological and an ontological appreciation of structures of thinking, which aren't, of course, the only structures of thinking. There's plenty of other world visions that don't have those dichotomies. But in kind of the, you know, since the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution and so on, this kind of thinking has become normalized. It's becoming the way to see the world in some ways. And as part of that, a particular vision of economy as a machine, as a structure, a system that had these moving parts that worked together, that had these dynamics of reproduction and accumulation, that was privileging a certain kind of labour, wage labour, where everyone used to work for each other or work for themselves. Now they're all being drawn into proletarianisation and working for wages, for world markets. The idea of a market that is a capitalist market. The idea that there's a business model that is the most efficient, the most reliable, the capitalist private enterprise model. And going along with private property and, you know, financial investment that's for profit and so on. These kinds of ideas became folded into a conception of economy that was named capitalism by Marx, and was named kind of, you know, the free market or the money economy or the market economy. It's got lots of different names depending on what kind of paradigm you're coming from in economics. But as I read from many of you, the term capitalism is still very much in use as something that we are challenging, critiquing, and somehow always being dominated by. So when Julie and I wrote our book in 1996 called The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, in brackets, subtitle, A Feminist Critique of Political Economy, the picture on the front of the book that was published by Blackwell was all very black and red, and it looked like some kind of member of some sort of German Marxist party manifesto. But it had a picture of Sisyphus. Now, I don't know how many of you know the story of Sisyphus, the ancient kind of Greek myth. He was the man that rolled a huge stone up a hill, always to have it rolled back down on him. So the picture is this very old woodcut of an ancient fellow rolling this big hill, this big stone up a hill, and it always came back. So this was, it's kind of that story of work to do something, to change something, but it always kind of rebounds on you. So that was the image that Blackwell came up with to signify what our book was. Later on, there was a Turkish translation of the book, and they had a much more feisty picture of a robot, you know, with kind of machine inside, training up people, holding up the earth and biting off bits of it. So, and over on the side there were two little girls throwing their little pebbles with slingshots like David and Goliath, you know, sort of. I haven't got a picture of it here, I'll show you probably tomorrow in the lecture, but it's a much more kind of, I guess it's a symptomatic kind of, a picture that appeals to me more than Sisyphus. But this thinking was our stones. These are what we're trying to lob into capitalism. This idea that we've got a discourse that enrolls the incredible differentiation and variety of the world into something that makes it kind of systemic and almost homogeneous. So when we started working on this kind of thing, everyone was interested in what we call the internationalization of capital, the movement of capital around the world, setting up branch plants and export processing zones in Asia, and, you know, footloose capital becoming global, and then globalization, all the ways in which those economic processes fed into cultural processes and other things. And the world was becoming one big thing, and many cultural and social theorists said, well, we can't think outside of capitalism. Capitalism is it. And we thought, well, that's a statement that's being posed as a statement of reality. It's a kind of a statement of critical realism that says, I'm criticizing this thing, but this thing is real. And Julie and I thought, well, wait a minute, you know, we don't want to keep projecting or doing the kind of theory that shores up that vision. So much of radical political economy that we were trained in was just continually exposing the next thing that capitalism was doing, you know, in horror. And the idea was to do that in order to transcend capitalism. Let's, you know, understand the beast in order to change it, as Marx would say. But every time we did another bit of research on what it was doing, we were kind of shoring up its power as the only possible economy. And we then became influenced by the kind of feminist thinking that was going on in feminist post-structuralism and queer theory, and we said, let's bring that back into economy and say, well, hey, this is a discourse that's creating this kind of feelings of power. Obviously, there are horrible things going out in the world, but do we want to participate as researchers and theorists in making this more real? Or do we want to start liberating other kinds of economic practices from this kind of situation where as soon as you saw, you know, small business or informal activities, you know, in a city, they were always on the way to becoming capitalist. Or so, you know, they were positioned always in relation to a capitalist norm. So capitalocentrism is something that I think is still with us, and I think we can probably, there's that kind of gut sense that how can we possibly have a world economy that isn't somehow organised and integrated. And yeah, but at the same time, there's a lot of overblown statements to do with capitalocentrism. You know, the market organises the world. Well, markets have to be constructed. They have to be made. They have to be regulated. You know, and there's many different kinds of markets. But somehow people will say, well, that's the global market, as if that's one big thing and it's got this kind of mechanistic organising framework. When we look at the kind of work that's done to make those things work, we can see there's a lot of places where there's openings, cracks, and so on. So this, yeah. So I guess the big point, or one of the points behind this work, is that rather than seeing the kind of work we're doing as theorists was to explain the kind of structures that were organising the world, the capitalist mode of production, you know, globalisation, a sort of structural vision that as radical theorists we could peer through the veils of everybody's misunderstanding and get down to this deep structure that was really kind of running the world. We saw that what we're doing as theorists is making ethical interventions in how we see the world, and that there's a sort of a choice to be made as to which things we put together and say are connected and more strong than others. Not that there's nothing in the world telling us which way to do this, that we're coming out of traditions that make us see certain things more than other things. So if we start to reflect on this, then, and if we're interested in moving beyond structuralism, a post-structuralist point of view, for a political reason, because that structuralist view wasn't helping inform any kind of what we could see as really progressive change, then our explanation is in some ways a lot weaker, but it's also more reflective and hopefully more ethical. So this also goes along then with an ontological and a epistemological change from a kind of critical realist perspective, where as theorists we're just trying to reflect what's going on in the world with a radical sensibility, to interrogating what are we actually performing by the knowledge we create. What kinds of worlds are we making more real and making less real? So these kinds of shifts were what informed our work. The other thing that led us into thinking about the economy as differentiated, as not all capitalist, was something very classical, coming out of classical Marxism, this interest that Marx had in the different ways that societies organise the production of surplus, its appropriation and its distribution. So rather than talking about class as segments or class fractions or identities, we were interested in a kind of an anti-essentialist form of Marxism that looked at class relations as processes. And so that one could talk about, instead of seeing the world as moving from, some sort of subsistence to kind of feudalism to capitalism, this kind of stagist vision, we could see today coexisting many different class processes in which some people are involved in wage labour and their labour is being exploited, and that surplus that's being extracted is being privately accumulated and in a kind of capitalist class process. But many other people are working for themselves as small farmers or as small business people, kind of exploiting themselves, working long hours in order just to make a living, foregoing holidays, etc. There's a kind of class process of the independent producer. There's also still, of course, a feudal class process in the world where people are working for others and their labour in kind is appropriated and taken and used for private wealth or and slave production as well. And of course what we've always been interested in is all the forms of and experiments with collective class processes where people get to decide how much do they want to work for, how much is surplus, what will happen with that surplus. Does it go back to the community? Does it come back to us as higher wages? Does it go into environmental repair? And there's been a history, throughout the world of collective class processes, which is the kind of lost to view in a lot of mainstream economics. So Marx already had a vision of economic diversity. It's just that his theory got enrolled for many people into a stagist vision of society. Once you take that away and start to look at the processes, that's one way you can start to see we don't have a capitalist world. We have a world in which there's many different class processes, and the task of the theorist is to start to analyse these things. But that's just one axis of differentiation. What we did was start to look at the variety of, so that's the differentiation that might be seen as differentiating enterprises. Are they organised around a capitalist class process or a non-capitalist one, like a collective class process or an independent class process? Or are they a capitalist firm that's operating as a not-for-profit or as a green capitalist that's actually putting money back into environmental repair rather than into private accumulation? That's just one axis of differentiation we could look at. What, of course, feminists were always interested in was the differentiation of labour. To say, well, wage labour is one form of labour, but what about all the unpaid labour that's keeping the world up? The whole work in the household, in the community, care labour, reproduction, having children, raising children, creating networks in the society, looking after the elderly. And this became much more of interest through feminism. People arguing for wages for housework and care labour and so on. And of course it's become much more recognised now in governments to say, well, if we look at GDP, the monetised part of that, or the commodified part, is one part, but all the other value that's been created in the household and in the community is also what's creating well-being, and they should be seen as part of the economy. So we started to differentiate different forms of labour, and similarly did the same thing with markets. As I said, there's many ways that people transact goods and services. Not all of them are by a monetised market. So once you start to inventory the world in this way, you can start to fill out this kind of, these kinds of, they're really just practices. What we're doing is moving away from the economy as a system to economic practices, the practices that people are involved in. And of course, all of us are involved in multiple practices. We're not just one economic subject. I do that, sometimes I'm this, sometimes I'm this, Sometimes I'm working in a state-owned university. I mean, I'm doing all these things simultaneously, and each of them gives me some kind of economic identity. But what's interesting is the variety of practices down here, and one could start to unpack the variety of wage relations as well. It's not that there's not diversity in those top layers, but we're focusing here to kind of make the point that there's a lot more to the economy than just that top layer. This is work from I've done in the Philippines, where you take those kind of practices of labour, just looking at that left-hand column, and start to see the different language there is in a local community for different forms of reciprocal labour, different forms of labour that's paid in kind, or volunteer labour, different kinds of gifts, forms of credit. These are this is the diverse language that is out there of these very specific economic relationships that you can start to see are creating well-being, and sometimes they're creating exploitation, they're creating all sorts of things, but they're certainly to enroll them all into a capitalist world order in which these are somehow just a subordinate, insignificant, primitive, to be superseded kind of practices, is to deny the fact that these are what have been keeping people alive throughout millennia. These kinds of things. And lately in the last book, we also started to look at diverse forms of property, and this taps in a lot to the work on commons, customary land, and so on. People like Ostrom and others have looked at. But also finance and the ways in which investment takes place, not just through mainstream markets. Clearly microfinance has been a huge issue, and has a very there's a lot of debate around its role, but certainly forms of sharing finances have been again around since millennia in most communities, and family lending and donations and so on. So from that this is really a deconstruction. It's looking at the radical heterogeneity that exists in the world, and what I haven't done is done the kind of radical heterogeneity up on the top layer, but one could do that as well, and in post-capitalist politics we do that. But in terms of just the next step, inventorying things is achieve something. But what do we do with that? So what? So what? The world's diverse. And this is where our kind of more normative political project has come in. And so our our work is really to say what kind of economies do we want to perform and create and strengthen and so on. And of course, this kind of inventory has a lot of things that we don't necessarily want to, slavery, I don't know that we want to perform that anymore. Theft, who knows? Sometimes theft is righteous, and people are taking back things that are rightly theirs. Who knows? All of these things raise ethical questions as to what are they producing. And so we started to say, well, we're interested in particular concerns in a community economy. And it's not about, for us, why we work is to produce the means of survival. So how do we think about surviving well? What is the kind of constellation of these practices that might contribute to well-being? Not just human well-being, but also ecological well-being or environmental well-being. So these are the kind of concerns of a community economy. How do we survive well? What are the kind of pay rates that allow people to survive well? What are the exorbitant pay rates that are just producing kind of huge disparity in the world and are actually decreasing the surviving well of people? So these are the kind of questions that come up, and the kind of questions that then motivate the kind of research we do. So when it comes to enterprise, we're interested in surplus. Surplus is, in a sense, what we have to work with in a society. It's what we have to use to look after the young, to look after the elderly, to have cultural institutions, to repair our environment. It's kind of the wealth that we can garner that's beyond what we need, what the producers who are producing that wealth need to live. It's what we have to distribute in a society. So how are we doing that? And which of these kinds of practices are distributing surplus in ways that we see as benefiting the planet in some way? And then in terms of markets, again, why do we have markets? Why do we have transactions? It is usually to help us survive well. But so many of the market transactions we have are just increasing, again, environmental degradation and economic inequality. So who is it that we encounter through our transactions, and how do we encounter other people through those transactions in ethical ways? So this is a concern of the community economy, to unpack markets that kind of dehumanize commodities and we don't even know where something's been produced, to sort of start to say, how do we have ethical interactions through our transactions? And the concern around property is this idea of commoning. How do we make and share that which we need to survive, those things that become taken over by as property relations? How do we share those things? How do we common them? And lastly, why do we have finance? We're really saving things up to have a future in some ways. So how do we invest in futures through these kinds of mechanisms? So this is the kind of shift to what we call community economy concerns. And they are, I guess, what motivates a lot of the research we do, is to say, let's look for examples or work with communities or with metrologies or governments who are interested in these kinds of practices in some way or form. And let's research those and work with people to strengthen those kinds of things. Now, not to say that many of these things are also undermined by other practices, by greed, by all sorts of coercion, collusion, monopolization, all these other things that aren't necessarily just capitalism or capital. Coercion, distrust, rent-seeking behaviour, those things have been around forever in every social system. I don't know, we don't have to always line them up with capitalism or capitalist enterprise. There's also capitalist enterprises that are doing some of these things. So this is opening up our world in certain ways. So it's a kind of reframing, and that's what we use this image of, is it two faces or is it a vase? This picture at the top, the classic psychology reframing issue. What are we looking at here? And so we're interested in, this is something we've used in a lot of action research with people, this idea that this is what's seen as the real economy up here above the waterline, but actually people are doing all these kinds of things, and once we start to see ourselves in all the different parts of this iceberg, it gives us a different kind of sense of what's possible. This is a vision or a version of the iceberg that was used in research in the Pacific. It's a floating coconut rather than iceberg. And here we were using it to look at gender and issues of who does what. But as you can see, most of what people are doing, this is mapping out all the different practices people are involved in, are in these things that are really underneath the waterline, seen as not part of the real capitalist formal economy. But these are the things that are keeping people alive, and they're the things that are being threatened when the world says, oh, you need a free trade arrangement that'll knock out certain kinds of practices and so on. So you can use this kind of work to look back at policy, look back at changes that are happening in the world, and try and unpack, in what direction they're moving towards more commoning or uncommoning. I love this picture. This is a three-dimensional iceberg that was used by community researchers, where people are going up to there's someone sitting in that thing, looking out into those eyes. And they're going up and writing down all the different things that they are involved in. Okay, this is the same thing from the Pacific, where men and women wrote out the different kinds of things they did. So it can be used to look at a kind of gender division of labour as well. This is another use of the kind of iceberg idea by an artist activist in England, who is working in communities in East London where it's working class communities where a lot of the people there who are elderly now, as children, used to go with their families. The parents worked in factories, and in the summertime they couldn't stop working, but they would go out to Kent and harvest hops and other fruits and vegetables, which now Eastern European migrants are doing. But in these days, the working class of London would take a summer holiday, and the kids would all go and live in camps while the parents were harvesting. And so Katherine Byrne has kind of worked with these groups to go back and visit some of these hops growing areas where a lot of these older people went as children. But part of her art practice is to get people involved in, or that people have got involved in gleaning and collecting fruits and other kinds of products in London and around London, like going on excursions to Heathrow, for instance, where the airport is, what used to be all apple orchards, and there's still trees around that you can get the apples from, or they go and visit other parts of London, and they've developed a small social enterprise called Company Drinks, which is playing on the notion of company as good company, hanging out together, not just an enterprise. And they're making these drinks and also continually picking more things and connecting into the people who, it's a kind of interesting, someone asked about the relationship between economy, culture and society. Well, this is an interesting one that kind of is meshing up between cultures and economies and ethnicities, and because then people go and chat to the Eastern European migrants who are now doing the work that their parents used to do, and in a kind of context of Brexit, it's an interesting kind of way of bringing people together around what really matters. And as an artist, she's got this great ability to kind of start representing then the flows that are happening through this kind of practice. So that's just a little example of how this reframing can be taken and used in a context. I think some of you are quite interested in food politics and so on. This is just a local community-based food, taking back food to simply be something that really means something to people. And these are the kind of practices that many of them are diverse economy practices, gleaning, community gardens, and so on, that she's worked with. So that is an introduction to some of the thinking behind the diverse economies work and the community economy kind of interventions and action research. And I think the readings kind of tap into those ideas, but develop them in different ways in terms of new methods and so on. But what I have now is a listing of those people who put in a small statement of what they were doing, and I have listed them here. I just picked out the kinds of things you're interested in and some of the questions that you asked. And this was what I was thinking we could start to work on in some kind of organised fashion between the researchers who have done some research and the people who are starting out. So let's just have a look at who we've got. Alberto, hi there. And are you, which one are you? Are you someone who's done some research, or are you about to start?
Yeah, I did, but now I'm about to start a new one.
Okay. And that's going to be about farmers and eaters?
Most likely.
Yeah. So you're wanting to understand trays, nodes, intersections within social relationships, and how can they be detached from capitalism?
Correct.
Got any answers yet?
No.
After my lecture, haven't you got some answers?
No, that's why I want to study, because I don't know about it, so I'm really curious about what...
Well, okay, now who has done some research that could help with this? Let's see. How do I pronounce this name? Next one. Songwoon, is she here? Yes. Oh, he, sorry.
Yeah.
I probably got the wrong name.
It's my nickname. It's my original name.
Okay.
Yeah.
And have you started research?
Yes, I'm now doing research on that topic, the emergent act of agrarian prosumer, which is somehow meant for kind of combining combination or distinct identity between producer and consumers in the era of post-productivism society.
Okay.
Because they have shared lots of ideas, knowledges, informations in communication and
How
effect.
about you stop now, because it seems like you two could have an interesting conversation. So let me can I just stop you there for a second? Because it seems like you farmers and eaters, prosumers, could be an interesting conversation to have. So let's just say you two are a good pair, and keep that for a minute, because I need to go through the rest of the list and pair people out. So don't tell us any more yet. Okay? I'm just stopping you there, because once we've got it.
Okay.
Okay. So then, how do I pronounce this? Veal?
Veerle.
Veal?
Yeah.
Oh, Veal. So where are you?
Here.
Oh, you're filming.
Yeah.
You have to stay out of this.
No.
Well, she has read them, she's participating.
Yeah.
Oh, she's cynical towards small-scale anti-capitalist initiatives. Okay, what's the use of glorifying those when they offer no real alternative? Will either be subsumed into capitalist structures or be too small yet to take away political unrest. Okay, so you've got a kind of critical edge here, and who can we find that can have a conversation with you to convince you that your cynicism might be stopping you from doing some interesting research? Okay, let's see. Can we just hold that one for the moment? Inez, here. How to actually activate people, how to engage in a wider audience. So you're starting out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you haven't got a particular topic yet.
No, but I wrote this because I'm part of this kind of critical student group, otherwise it's called. And we try to activate people, actually.
Right.
And to show these alternatives you are critical on, actually.
Right.
But yeah, I think many people are cynical about it.
Okay. Okay, so we need to find someone to talk to you about who's activated people. They can tell you how they did it. Okay. So we're just going to come back to you in a second. Lucy, hi. You want to legitimize informal food economies of Czech urban gardeners. Sounds good. Have you started that yet?
Yeah.
Oh, you have. So you're already.
I'm kind of in the middle of it.
Okay, how can we use economic language to empower diverse economies instead of co-opting them and reducing them to utilitarian strategies? And that sounds like a bit of a doubting theme here, but do you think you've got some strategies?
Yeah, I think it really relates to how you use the language, because I feel like sometimes when you really start using economic terms, on one hand, you kind of make things sound more serious and legitimate, but on the other hand, you also run the risk of kind of disregarding the other aspects.
Okay. So you could also, an interesting discussion could be between you and Alberto and Josh about the use of language in that kind of framing, and that might help answer some of your questions about how do you activate people. So I'm thinking there's a threesome there. Okay. All right, let's just keep moving on. Sharon, is it? Yes?
Sharon.
Sharon, you've done already some research on food cooperatives in the US, and you've also looked at how they negotiate processes and so on?
Yes.
Yeah, so you've probably got something you can tell us about all that.
I suppose so.
Yeah, okay, great.
But I guess
Yeah.
I have found maybe a larger question or something I need to extend.
All right.
And it came out of my PhD defense, which was last week.
Oh.
And it was related to one of my opponents asking about the language used in one of the cooperatives as to whether they were in fact anti-capitalist in their approach. And I had one main case study that was much larger and perhaps one could say more steeped and working within the capitalist framework and using less radical language, and then the other which was not. And
Okay.
I answered the question, and I felt like I needed to go back and explore a little bit more if what I saw could be interpreted differently in a more activist way. So-
Great. Okay. Well, we can get you to do that. We can rerun your thesis defense, and you can try that again, and we can go through that. That'd be great. Okay. So I'm just trying to think who you might pair up with on that front. We could also go into that other crowd, but let's just think about that. Maria, how can we? Which one's Maria? Hi there. And you're starting out, right?
I'm in the middle of writing my thesis.
Master's thesis?
Yeah.
And have you done some research?
Yeah, it was 4 months doing the field work
Whereabouts was that?
in Goa.
In Cuba. How can we analyse family economy from a community economist point of view? That's one of the questions. Can we consider family as a small community? Great, okay. Have you got some ideas on that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you could actually fit together with small scale initiatives, which was field, which is where?
Field.
Oh yes, that's right, yeah. Okay. Oops. Maria, then Nozomi. The struggles and initiatives taken by young farmers in the Netherlands. That's one of your interests?
Yes.
And where are you in the process?
I just have this idea, and I was thinking of doing a thesis, but maybe an internship or
Okay, can everyone hear? Okay, so you're about to start out potentially,
Yes.
and questions of identity and the social role of community economy, of the researcher.
Yes.
So it's sort of more of a methods kind of area you're
Yes.
interested in. Okay, good. Now, Leanne, yeah, you are doing research or have done?
I just finished my paper.
Okay, on meal sharing
Yeah.
via a platform, and so why people participate in meal sharing, as well as what role the practice of meal sharing has in people's everyday life. So you've got some interesting findings to tell us about.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, terrific, terrific. Okay, and then Marianne, yep. How socially? Where are you in the process? You're finishing research, or?
Yeah, I've done a few case studies. I'm starting another one in September.
Social innovations in informal care, and again technological platforms. So that might be you, and Leanne might have a good little interchange about.
We know each other already.
Oh, you can just
That
rehearse
doesn't mean
the
that we
things.
can, but it would be nice to have someone else, a new person.
Okay. How can the role of institutions be integrated into the diverse economies approach? Okay. All right. Now, Shivani. Yes. Now, where are you in the process?
I'm right in the middle, I guess. I did field work before doing a PhD proposal.
Ooh.
So now I'm
Was that a wise thing to do?
Well, it's like the second time around because it's becoming more mixed methods, more meta-theoretical.
Ooh.
Because I started out quantitative and I realized, well, quantitative and qualitative, I was teaching in Bhutan and
Yeah.
at the same time collecting data with my students. We were talking a lot about gender changes. So they were telling me we have an issue with eating disorders among our peers.
Yeah.
I was surprised, given that new media only entered in 1999 television. So I'm trying to understand this emergence of kind of possessive individualism, which is kind of marked by an introduction of a lot of substance abuse, eating disorders, and specifically suicide is like per capita one of the highest in Asia. Suicide rates in the country of gross national happiness.
Yes, right.
So I want to understand maybe a comparative study, because I was really working with university students, but I'm curious what people are doing outside of the university.
Okay.
Specifically in the family, are there protective resources? Specifically, the kind of co-parenting that happens in Bhutan when you have an interdependence type of parenting?
I'll stop you there because we don't want to get into it yet.
Yeah.
We're going to do it when we hear it more. But it does seem to me that, did we get to the other? No. Someone was interested in the kind of relationship between culture, society and economy. I can't remember, I think I didn't put it in as a question, but does the social and cultural kind of drop out when we focus on the economy? So who was the person that wrote that? Yeah. So that, I mean, that could be an interesting way of thinking about
And the family, as an institution, for example.
Okay,
A
good.
household really is what I'm looking at.
Okay. So you know what I'm thinking we'll do, rather than me try and map you together, once I know we'll go through this, just have a think. Maybe we'll have a quick break and you guys will cluster around each other and figure out who it is you want to have the conversation with. So just keep remembering who's doing what. Okay, then Siska, where are you in the process?
Yeah, this was a research project in my master's. So I did the
Right.
So I guess
How food waste collectives operate and transitioning to sustainable and autonomous food systems. To what extent must research participants understand theories of the diverse economies that they're enacting?
Yeah, that's just so broad.
That's a broad question. Yeah. Okay, so that food waste collectives, there's also the meal sharing and the informal care. That could also be an interesting connection. Now, I'm aware that we've got like half of a group here, or half the group haven't produced or given me some insight into what they're doing. I'm not sure whether you want to quickly try and do that. And then I think we should have a little break, and I think you guys should talk to each other quickly and figure out who it is you want to have a conversation with. And then we might have time for some really quick kind of fishbowl discussions between you, and I'll come in on it. So I think probably two and three, you're looking at a group of 2 or 3 to form. So should you quickly tell us, Zulfa, do you want to tell us quickly what you're up to?
Yes. I'm researching about the legitimization of roundtable on sustainable palm oil in Indonesia.
I didn't catch that. Can you just say a bit slower?
Okay, so I'm researching about the legitimization of roundtable on sustainable palm oil, so certification and governance system.
Okay.
So in Indonesia, so
that's a kind of governmental process.
Yep.
Your certification. Yeah. Great.
Mm-hmm.
So you could also, you might be interested to go in with someone who's talking about the role of institutions in diverse economies. Okay. And have you done research now, or?
Yeah, I'm in the middle.
You're in the middle. Great. Okay. Vicky.
Yeah. Actually, I haven't really started yet, and I don't really have a very concrete idea. But now I'm thinking about doing fair trade in the Japanese context, and by analyzing the case of the largest supermarket chain in Asia.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a long history of fair trade. It's probably where it started almost in Japan with the Banangon bananas and
it could
so
be,
on.
but I think the history for the supermarket is not so long.
No.
It's only like 10 years or something.
Okay, so the supermarket is like a mainstream business, or is it a cooperative?
It's a mainstream business, but I think maybe it's different in the case of Japan.
Yeah.
Because now we're more like we're more used to the discourse provided by the Western context.
Yeah.
So maybe I think in Japan it's not so mainstream as in the Western.
Right. There's also a lot of consumer cooperatives, aren't there?
Yeah.
In Japan.
Could be.
Yeah. So you could maybe come together with people who are interested in food distribution. I think there were a few others. Okay.
Yeah, I am study this kind of products, packaged food, corporate packaged food in the slums, in Manila slums, how these products are changing the dynamics of the slums. And probably with Sharon I can learn a little bit, because one of my studies is with retailers, micro retailers, small stores, window stores, street vendors, but also I study consumers and the new forms of entrepreneurship based on this.
On these little things. Yeah. In what country?
Manila,
in
Philippines.
Manila.
I am from Mexico, but I study Manila.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry stores.
I am.
Yes. Okay, great. Jessica?
Yeah, I'm interested in processes of policy making and how people participate. And what I'm particularly interested in right now is how we deal with competing values and visions.
Okay.
And I think that's particularly relevant for diverse economies or community economies. How do we grapple with competing values and visions?
And so where are you in the process of research?
All over the place. I finished my PhD a few years ago, and I'm working.
And you've
on
done
various,
field work or study? Yes.
Yeah, mostly at the global level, but we have several projects at local level and regional level as well.
Okay. So again, another institutional kind of policy
very
kind
much
of
policy.
collection. Yeah. Okay. And Silava.
I'm working on cooperatives in Madagascar. why there is no co-op at all, no farmers, no consumer co-op.
Really?
And trying to understand why first, and what can be done to. There were many attempts to introduce, but always failed.
Right.
And there's a new initiative from within, from the farmers themselves, and try to understand that process and how can be multiplied. And another aspect is different thing is I'm working on land grabbing as well. Land grabbing.
Land grabbing, yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Where is this? Sorry.
In Madagascar.
In Madagascar.
So, what was? Please correct me. My historical knowledge. What was the colonial history of Madagascar? Was it, or did it have a colonial?
It was colonized by the French for 60 years.
Right, and there was no attempt to set up producer co-ops?
There was, but it didn't fit. It failed. Like it served the purpose of the colonial power, and once they kind of withdraw the control, then
it's interesting. Okay, so I mean that could also be connections with families and groups connecting to those ideas of collectivity which are imposed. Maybe connecting to family. I don't know. Anyway, okay. Now,
hi. Yes, I'm from Indonesia, and I'm doing research about the reconstruction of meanings and practices of halal in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Because we have new standards, new law, and I'm trying to understand how this new standards, new law has produced some reconstruct new meanings and practices of halal and it works also.
That's also another interesting one of economy, culture, and kind of coming together, and different politics, I presume. Too.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Shuji.
Actually, I'm busy supervising this.
Right, you've got some great students here.
But right now, my interest is about the Dutch agriculture model. So in Japan right now, the Dutch agriculture is quite common and popular because the Japanese agriculture is now in a crisis. So the Japanese government and the mainstream business sectors are promoting and encouraging farmers and the public to believe if we follow the Dutch model, we can survive.
And what are the elements of the Dutch model? Is that the secular agribusiness?
Yeah, so there are two different kinds of Dutch model in my understanding.
Yes.
So one is the greenhouse, the capital intense, sophisticated agriculture, and the other one is care farming and other alternative.
Alternative
But
organic agriculture.
of course, the Japanese government is just looking at the
high tech.
So I'm trying to criticize.
And is it because? Well, there was a lot of movement out of the countryside anyway. So everyone in the countryside is pretty old and not wanting to do farming anymore.
Given the condition of the Japanese agriculture, it is meaningless to follow the Dutch model. So the modern facilities. So I'm trying to introduce the different kind of Dutch model.
Right.
But they look for the best side of the Dutch model.
The best side of the Dutch model. The best side of the which side?
They don't want to go to the American style, right? So they look for an alternative to follow the globalized American style.
Right.
So they look for the best side of the Dutch.
But the best
At least that's how I understand.
Is the best the high tech version or not? Which in your view?
Because we study the dark side of the Dutch farming model, so they study the best side. Right? No, we do things together, of course.
Which is the site is multifunctional.
Well, you can discuss about that.
Yeah.
But anyway, we work together.
Right. Okay. So, given I've given one supervisor a chance to say something and do something, what about this little cluster of people over in the corner that we haven't heard anything from? You guys want to say something about what you're doing? Work-wise, in terms of this context or not? I mean, you don't have to be part of the fishbowl if you don't want to be, but just for the sake of hearing.
Yeah, so now we will elaborate on this afternoon on the Diverse program. But I can say two words about my background. So I did a PhD in science and technology studies, focusing on nanotech development. Then I switched my focus on life sciences, but it was still within the complex of science and technology studies. But then I became increasingly more interested in agro-food studies, and also from a more normative point of view, so with the diverse economies as a particular concept related to that. So you could say that I'm, on the one hand, a little bit experienced in doing research, but on the other hand, the field is quite new for me.
Okay. Right.
But we will discuss it.
Yeah, we're going to have a discussion this afternoon about that research project, so I don't know whether you want to add any more at this point. Yes, no? All right. Okay, well, you guys are the main story anyway, because you're the people who are wanting to be researchers and keep going with this kind of stuff. So I'm thinking we should stop now for a coffee for 10 minutes, and you should find the people that you want to have the discussion with, not too many, and then we'll see how many groups we have, and we'll allocate time accordingly, and it'll be like, I've just been watching this thing called Pitch Battle on TV, and it's two choirs, and they have to kind of sing each other out, you know. I don't think we should do that, no. But I mean, I think you have to be you have to poise your insight from your research or your question pretty quickly, and let the other person do it, and then have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll have a bit of a wider discussion. So have a think about it, and figure out who you'd like to have the conversation with, and we'll see what happens.